attempts to adapt it to the audience, to make it more suitable and a bit more entertaining. And the subject I chose, I gave it the title, The Virtual Tourist. And the idea is that where do you go at the end of the day when you're tired but still connected to the internet? Well, sadly, the majority of the male population might go to the dark side, but I've got my own version of escapism. And my own version of escapism is Google Earth. Now, Google Earth was originally Earth Viewer 3D, made by Keyhole Incorporated, which was originally a CIA-funded company, but it was acquired by Google in 2004. And as I'm sure you know, it stores aerial views of every point on the Earth you might imagine. So by 2006, there were about 100 terabytes worth of data just for the raw images. But by 2008, Google Street View came into play, in which you actually had street views as well. So the amount of data stored for this went up by orders of magnitude, I should think. So where do you go at the end of the day? Or where do I go? And the answer is really anywhere and everywhere. For example, I've always had a fascination with extreme geography. Take an example, the Australian outback. Now, interestingly enough, all those long and lonely roads through the outback, the Google have been covered by the Google car, which basically records everything. So you can zoom into those, beam yourself down, as it were, into the middle of the Australian outback, and have a look around, see what it's like. It's surprisingly empty. Occasionally you come across a roadside, something like Darwin, 1,500 miles, but really there is nothing there, and it is very, very creepy. So after wandering around in this sort of oven-like outback for a while, you start thinking about, well, what about the other extremes, those cold, forgotten parts of the Earth? Well, I grew up during the Cold War in Europe, sandwiched between the US in the west, way across the Atlantic, and the Soviet Union in the east, way across Eastern Europe. And I remember the generation ahead of me, perhaps unfairly complaining about, well, we're kind of stuck in the middle, so all those interballistic continental missiles that only make it halfway are going to land on us. But one thing I did find fascinating was that actually the United States and the Soviet Union were, and are, if the Soviet Union still existed, they're separated by less than 3 miles. That's because the Diomede Islands lie right in the Bering Straits. The Bering Straits obviously being just off between Siberia and the western tip of Alaska. And there are 2 islands right in the middle of that. There's Big Diomede, which is the Russian island, and Little Diomede, which is the US island. And the international date line goes right down the middle, but there's less than 3 miles between them. And in fact, in the winter, you can walk from one to the other across the ice, if you've got a passport, that is. But I remember thinking, well, who actually lives on this? What do they actually look like? Well, you can take it from me, they look awful. And this is the kind of thing you could zoom down and have a look. Well, the US village on Little Diomede it's like a cross between a junkyard and an oil refinery. And Big Diomede is even more bleak. It's just a few iconic ex-Soviet crumbling monuments to its name. So I can cross that one off the list. So with a click of the mouse, I'm beamed up, again, once high above the clouds. Which brings me to the other extremes. When I was small, I was brought up in the northwest of London. I remember walking down the road with my mother under the bridge into the town in that northwest part, and going to the butchers and the bakers and all those sort of shops. So amazingly, this is all covered by Google Street View. So the other day, I zoomed myself down, and there I was standing in front of a house that I hadn't seen for 45 years, and really it hadn't changed very much. So with a few clicks of the mouse, I'm going down Highwood Road, across the wall at the end of the road, which still exists to stop the traffic going through, down Halegrove Gardens, although I hadn't remembered the name of it, and it's amazing. All the houses, they all look exactly the same 45 years later. For example, the house with the odd corner, the odd windows on the corner, but the house next to it had been renovated, so there are some changes, but really not very much. So it's interesting to think about all this Google Street Viewing. It has required quite a few Google cars with 360-degree cameras to traverse all these routes, and this has been going on since before 2008. And one thing, very little known fact about it, is that these can actually drive themselves. They have to have a driver in the driver's seat, but They have about $70,000 worth of laser radar system on top, so they know way better than any human exactly what is around, and about $80,000 worth of computing power. So these cars basically can take the hands off the wheel and they can drive. And in fact, they've had one accident in 2000. The first accident was in August 2011. This was after several 100,000 miles of these cars. And it was a designated human was driving at the time. And the next accident happened when one of these cars was rear-ended at a stoplight. So the results have been fairly good. And actually in June 2011, the state of Nevada passed a law permitting the operation of driverless vehicles, and California has done the same. So it's an interesting trend that these particular cars for taking these views has put in motion. And not surprisingly, they've caught some pretty interesting views over all these hundreds of thousands of miles that they've been traveling. Now, dispensing with the numerous naked sunbathers, of which there are many, it's caught things like people breaking into buildings, for example. It's caught Italian moped riders violently distracted by the curvaceous pedestrian on the sidewalk, has a few of those. It also has people in hot pursuit of the Google car who are obviously not very pleased by the implied lack of privacy, because these vehicles have a tower on the top and a big camera, so it's pretty clear what they're doing, and however high your fence might be, it probably looks over the top of it. And also one of my favourites along those lines was one of these vehicles passing a street sign with one of these automated displays clearly showing that the vehicle was speeding. So I don't know if the particular vehicle was sticking to the speed limit in that case. But it is unfortunate that then, after a while, you are tempted to get a little bit nosy. And you think, for example, that high and mighty high school friend that you kept in touch with but moved out to California who had this very impressive address, what's their neighbourhood really like? The interesting thing is, of course, you just beam yourself down and have a walk around the neighbourhood and find out. You might be quite surprised. Thank you. And now on to the third. Oh yes, of course. Thank you, Dan.